and welcome to the Culture Intelligence webinar. Now, it's a pleasure to be here today talking to an expert about this topic. So for this webinar, what we're going to be doing is we're going to start with a brief introduction. Then we're going to talk a bit more about the definition of culture intelligence. Then we'll have a few questions for us to discuss. And then we'll dedicate some time for the Q&A. So if at any point throughout the webinar you have any questions, any doubts, feel free to let us know, share them with us in the chat, and then we'll come back to these during the fourth part of the webinar. And then finally, we will wrap up the webinar with a conclusion and also talking a bit more about the next steps. Now, a bit of introduction. My name is Roy Mouawad. I'm originally from Lebanon, and I'm the founder of Learning. Additionally, I'm a professor at several business schools in universities in Spain and in Germany. And I also work as a consultant and a researcher. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Viviane Vicente, who's a master facilitator at the Culture Intelligence Center, but also a consultant, a speaker, and a trainer who has more than 20 years of experience in the legal, public, and private security fields. Viviane, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
So to start with our topic today on culture intelligence, we hear a lot of people talking about social intelligence, emotional intelligence, how these can be applied at the workplace, their importance, their impact. So our question today is, what is the definition of culture intelligence?
Cultural intelligence, or CQ, as we call it, is the capability to function and relate effectively in culturally diverse situations. And we have this definition on a slide there, I believe. And I want to emphasize a couple of points about this definition. Firstly, that CQ goes beyond cultural awareness or cultural sensitivity. It goes beyond learning specific rules of behavior in different cultures. And it gives us a broadly applicable and scalable framework to improve our intercultural effectiveness. So the second key point here is that CQ is a capability, meaning it is not something innate or fixed, but something malleable. So it can always be improved. Anyone who wants to and intentionally works at it can develop their cultural intelligence, which will then help build the skills needed for being able to effectively navigate a variety of cultural contexts.
Okay. Now, in terms of the discussion, we've done some research there and we found a few interesting reports. One that was published by PricewaterhouseCoopers last year in 2021, in which they conducted a global study and they found out that 69% of organizations that adapted during the pandemic claimed that culture offers a competitive advantage. We also found a report published by the Society of Human Resource Management, where they actually mentioned that about 70% of international ventures that failed, they actually failed because of cultural differences. So they attributed the main reason for the failure to cultural differences. So my big question here is, what is then the importance? What is the relevance of cultural intelligence? Why is it important? Why would we need to talk about it at the individual level or at the team level, at the organizational level, and so on?
Well, I think the relevance of cultural intelligence can be quickly understood when we look at the statistics that you just showed, Roy. On the geographic side of this coin, we see the astonishing number of international ventures that fail due to the disregard for cultural differences or the lack of strategies or poor execution of these strategies in addressing cultural differences. We see the cost for transferring an employee and potentially their family to complete an overseas assignment, only to find that the leadership skills that they demonstrated in their home culture do not translate in the new environment. And this is so common. Of course, we see the different profiles across national and regional customer markets as some of the examples that prove that we need to look at how cultural norms, business practices, consumer preferences, and also management practices vary across cultures. But of course, cultural diversity is not just about geography. It's not just about national origin, race, ethnicity. We know that different generations will see the world and the workplace and work itself through different lenses. They will have different communication preferences. They will value different benefits when looking for a job. And the same is true for different genders, different functions. So engineers, lawyers, coders, and salespeople will probably approach the same project through very different perspectives. Each function will approach it through the perspective of what they were trained to do and their main purpose for the project. As an individual, navigating these differences can be really challenging and stressful. When we're working side by side with colleagues who do not view the decision-making process, the timelines, the contracts in the same way that we do, it makes things slower, more confusing, and draining. It gets frustrating. Even if you are all in the same city and you speak the same language, which is actually not that common anymore. In many organizations, that is not the reality. But even in our social life, we live in this era of deep polarization. We are polarized on political issues, religion, economic policies, and things like that. We are bombarded every day with information, much of which negative, and suddenly it's become difficult having a conversation with your neighbor, your boss, or even your spouse. It's become potentially volatile to have this type of conversation. So cultural intelligence will help us in perspective taking. We engage in perspective taking so we can learn from one another instead of simply agreeing to disagree. At the organizational level, the reality is that diversity is there. Diversity is a fact. It is just a fact that in most organizations, they employ people from, again, different genders, different age groups, ethnicities, geographic origins, and many organizations have offices, subsidiaries, or customers across regions of the same country and in other countries. We have 4 or 5 generations in coexisting in the workplace today, and again, they see the world in different ways, depending on what was happening in the world when they were growing up. Also, instances of social injustice in many places around the world, which affect us all as individuals and as professionals, affect different cultural groups in different ways. So for organizations, hiring employees with different cultural backgrounds does not automatically translate into their feeling included, safe, valued, heard. It doesn't automatically mean that they will feel comfortable to contribute to the best of their ability. So leaders need to be attentive to what these different cultural groups need, both internally with their workforce and externally with their customers, their suppliers, and the community. The reality is that 20, 30 years ago, companies were judged on the quality of their product or service and also on the environmental impact that they caused. Well, nowadays, it's not only that. They are also judged on the social impact they cause, the footprint on their workforce and the communities they serve. So you have the business cost, the reputational cost, and the human cost of overlooking cultural differences and the needs of cultural groups, different cultural groups. We have seen a few phenomena, such as the great resignation, starting with the pandemic. Now we have quiet quitting, which is employees are engaging less, being less productive, sometimes due to misalignment with company values or company practices, lack of inclusion, and the costs again are enormous. We know that employees are burning out or they are really leaving. So some are quiet quitting, some are really quitting. Employees are getting sick, which presents again a different kind of cost. And when they do leave, we know some studies show that the cost of replacing an employee amounts to about a year's salary. Um, Not only that, but the concept of psychological safety, as we see there, this is not a new concept in organizational psychology, but it's had a resurgence in recent years. So it shows us that teams learn more, produce more, innovate more when team members feel that they can act authentically and take interpersonal risks. So interpersonal risks being making suggestions, admitting a mistake, sometimes challenging the status quo. But the reality is that psychological safety looks differently across cultures. And cultural intelligence can be a powerful tool to help achieve it. Because voicing your opinion, admitting mistakes, those things do not occur in a uniform manner across cultures. And you might be misinterpreting a situation and creating an environment of discomfort and an exclusion if you don't know how to identify and address those differences. And finally, just on this point, it is very common to read in business articles that diverse teams innovate more, but that is not true all of the time. Studies show that without cultural intelligence, homogeneous teams outperform diverse teams. Because again, it is a lot harder, slower, more stressful to get things done when team members approach work and the work in different ways. Or if they're connecting only virtually without having the advantage of the cues that we perceive when we're meeting in person. What studies show is that when cultural intelligence is at play, diverse teams do outperform and far outperform homogeneous teams.
Okay, now if we think about the experience with the pandemic, what we went through, how different teams adapted to the pandemic and its requirements, in talking about hybrid, remote, virtual environments, we might come across a lot of challenges when dealing with teams, diverse teams, but more so in different types of environments. So this actually led us to ask ourselves, okay, but how can we deal with such differences? And what we've done is over the past few weeks, we've been collecting data from our network to better understand our perspective and our approach to such different situations. So what we found out, for instance, is when it comes to uncertainty and how we deal with uncertainty, about 68% of our respondents claim that they plan. They approach this situation of uncertainty by thinking about different scenarios, planning for these scenarios, and scrutinizing their plans. While 26% responded that they rely on their instinct, on their gut feeling. So as we can see here, there's a difference in terms of how we approach uncertainty. But then this could lead to some challenges, some conflict. So the big question to you here, Viviane, is how can we deal with such situations? What do we need to keep in mind in such situations?
Yes, and talk about uncertainty. The world that we've been living in since the pandemic uh, hit us and hit us all. So many things to keep in mind about these situations. We saw there a majority of your respondents preferred to examine different scenarios. And that may be true depending on the cultural group. So first, I would like to just talk about cultural values, and if we could, thank you. So cultural values are just this one invisible layer of diversity that we encounter. And these are preferences, okay? These are preferences that develop in us as a result of early socialization. That is not only the place where we grew up, but the people who influenced us the most at an early age. And they can explain a lot of those behaviors and a lot of those preferences that we saw in this example about trusting your instinct or examining various scenarios in approaching ambiguity and uncertainty. So before going to this specific cultural value, I just want to emphasize that these cultural values are just preferences, our natural inclination to view and approach situations. Yet, when we find different preferences across the same team, when relating to people, working with people who have different preferences, these can present challenges. And without cultural intelligence, it becomes harder to navigate those differences. Or even similarities, which are not always an advantage to be similar across cultural value preferences. But in the next slide, we can see a cultural value that may be related to how people responded to this question. So this is about uncertainty avoidance. Carefully considering different scenarios may have to do with high uncertainty avoidance. This is the extent to which you prefer to be flexible and adapt to changing circumstances or reducing and avoiding uncertainty. And it causes, this is the type of cultural preference that causes a lot of conflict on diverse teams, because low uncertainty avoidance individuals are usually comfortable with uncertainty, ambiguity, with trusting their instincts, relying on their instincts in the face of a new situation or an uncertain situation. They usually appreciate having flexibility, and they actually may feel restrained if given too many rules or procedures to follow. Now, those with a high uncertainty avoidance orientation tend to be more risk averse and feel comfortable if they know the protocols under which to operate. So this could be an example, the people who need to look at different scenarios, study the different scenarios and hypotheses. Now, when we don't have cultural intelligence, we may be deeply biased about those who have a different orientation from our own. Without cultural intelligence, those with a high uncertainty avoidance preference may view the low uncertainty avoidance colleagues as reckless. And the low uncertainty avoidance people may see the high uncertainty avoidance people as rigid or inflexible. So what do we need to keep in mind? What do we do when we find these differences? And we see a few tips there on the screen. So if on the same team, or maybe even if you're interacting with a client, a vendor, and you have a different preference with low uncertainty avoidance people, avoid dogmatic statements to be that restrictive with them as much as you can. Invite them to explore the unknown. Give them flexibility. If this is someone you lead, you manage, give them the flexibility, the autonomy that you can within your realm of influence, within the possibilities you have for a project or a task, for them to act more naturally with more flexibility. With high uncertainty avoidance individuals, give them more direction. Give them more indications of how the project should be approached, how much autonomy they have or they don't have for a task. That will probably help them feel safe. And so again, when you have these different preferences on a team, a little bit of each of these approaches will probably feel more inclusive to them.
Okay. Now, some other data that we collected had to do with the extent to which people feel comfortable with their work and personal lives overlapping. So this is when we saw, for instance, in many cases, individuals working on a team, each one of us in a different time zone, and we would start a call talking a bit more about our personal lives, and you would see that some individuals are not that comfortable with that. And in fact, we can see that in the numbers here, where about 80% of the respondents said that yes, more or less, they are fine with an overlap between work and personal life. But then we have a 20% that said, no, I don't really have that much of overlap between personal and work lives. So when we talk about different team interactions and how we, for instance, work in these virtual environments, how we schedule meetings, how we host or organize meetings, how can we deal with such situations when some people do actually perceive a meeting, for instance, as an event or a social event, while others don't feel that much comfortable with that overlap between personal and work lives?
And that's a great question. And of course, this can be a preference, and sometimes we are not even able to behave according to our preference. But in this particular question, I see one cultural value that may have to do with these different perceptions, and that is focus. So monochronic or polychronic. Focus is the extent to which you prefer to do one thing at a time versus approaching several things, or multitasking, or you're comfortable working on several projects at the same time. And bear with me, because I'm going to get to the point about your personal and professional life. But monochronic people then prefer to work on one project at a time and tend to prefer to keep their work and personal lives separate. So I'm going to confess, I'm certainly a monochronic. I like to have a separation between my personal and my professional life. Polychronic oriented people are comfortable shifting that focus across different tasks and projects, and also their personal and professional lives all the time, many times throughout the day. They're okay, usually okay, mixing work with personal. So again, cultural values are preferences, they're a result of how we were socialized from an early age. However, sometimes the situation, the context, requires us to behave not really according to our natural inclination. And COVID is a very good example of that. So many of us suddenly found ourselves having to work from home, mix our domestic life with our professional life, and do a load of laundry in between meetings and things like that. We were sort of forced to become polychronic. So we are able to flex our behavior. That doesn't mean that our natural preference, our natural inclination was of mixing the two. So here again, you see possible indicators of someone's preferences and a few tips of how to bridge those differences, how to deal with different preferences. So if you find people like me who are monochronic, try to always provide follow through. Make sure you are listening to the task and the work that they're trying to demonstrate. But also value the relationship. And when you can't meet a deadline, try to explain why, try to explain how you're going to make up for it. With polychronic people, try to find time to be flexible about mixing a little bit of the two. Explain the relational impact if you don't meet a deadline. If you have polychronics and monochronics in the same meeting, some will want to spend some time during that meeting talking about their personal lives. And they might even be a bit late to the meeting because they spent a couple of moments in the hallway talking to someone whose relationship was important to them, or taking a phone call that was important to them. So that's that mixing of the two. And try to, if it is not advisable for that occasion, if that meeting is not about to be an event, a social thing, try to make it clear to them. Listen, for this one, can we please just get down to business right away? Can we please not mix? And when it is possible, then yes, make it clear, okay, for this meeting, it is okay. So again, that everyone feels included, everyone has their preferences respected. And for those who are not as comfortable sharing their personal lives, try not to force activities on them that would make them feel uncomfortable.
Okay. So we've already talked about a few cultural values, but my next question to you is, if we think about the different tools, the different cultural values that we have, which other ones would you recommend that we use or we take into account when encountering such situations?
Sure. Well, there are, of course, many cultural value preferences that play a part in our personal and professional interactions. But a couple that are very prevalent in the workplace and which cause conflict, frequently cause conflict in the workplace. The one you see there is power distance. So this is your understanding of a more hierarchical style of relationship or leadership, or a more egalitarian style. So egalitarian, low power distance, and more hierarchical, high power distance. And this can be seen in the way that you give a lot or a little importance to titles and honorifics, and if you call everybody by their first name. And when I say you, I'm talking, depending on your cultural background, it can be inadmissible to call people by their first name, or yes, the preferred thing to do to call people by their first name. But not only that, of course, who can challenge authority? How important is the opinion of the formal leader in a situation? Many cultures, and I say country or regional cultures, are very clear on that, but many organizational cultures are also clear about that preference. So we have organizations such as Facebook or Meta, who claim to be more egalitarian. They see a change in title as something less important, so lateral moves, and they're almost title agnostic. And then you see organizations that are very clear about the hierarchy. So these differences can cause, again, a lot of misunderstanding, because not everyone is comfortable with that egalitarian approach. Not everyone is comfortable with dissenting from the opinion of the leader of authority. And we need to understand those differences and account for them. So if you do encounter these different preferences with people who are more on the lower power distance orientation, try to not pay too much attention and forego formalities. Create ways, when possible and appropriate, for them to question or challenge authority. But then say on your team, even though your organization is more lower power distance oriented, but you have people who come from a cultural background that values power, hierarchy, titles, then try to be careful in following the chain of command. If you're visiting an organization that values that kind of power structure, you shouldn't, for example, send a manager to talk to a vice president if this is important to them as an organization you're serving. So paying attention to those. and try to avoid questioning authority publicly. So again, if you have those different orientations. Now, of course, even in regional or national cultures with a more egalitarian approach, you will find organizations that need to have a high power distance orientation. So in law enforcement or the military, it wouldn't work for everybody to have the same decision-making power. You do need that chain of command as an example of organizational cultures. Another cultural value that causes a lot of misunderstanding is context. So this is about communication styles, whether you prefer a direct communication style, so say what you mean what you say, and the message is in the words, or if you prefer a more indirect style of communication. Not only the words that you're saying, but also your gestures, your use of silence and pause, and maybe the environment, the setting where you choose to have a conversation. Of course, the words also play a part in it. You see there a couple of possible indicators of this communication preference. So for low context people, you should depend on what they are saying. You should rely on what they are saying or writing, and you should also understand that that's what they expect from you. And they might say to you, can you be more specific? They need those specifics. They're not trying to interpret your message. So try to be more direct and explicit with your message. For high context people, and this is another example of sometimes how our biases will arise, because for high context people, indirect communicators, and again, I'm an indirect communicator for sure. If you are too explicit, too direct, they may see you as aggressive and rude. And with cultural intelligence, we first learn to understand that they are not trying to be aggressive or rude, but we also, direct communicators also need to understand that they may be a bit more sensitive to explicit words. And so try to recognize the importance of silence, pause, choose the words, say things like, let me think about that, instead of responding right away with something very, very explicit. Again, these are not only about national cultures, it can be about generations that have these different communication preferences, but organizationally, you may also find different preferences.
Okay. So, Viviane, you've already mentioned a few cultural values that can be very useful to us in such situations. But my next question to you is, okay, then, if I'm interested in improving my cultural intelligence, how can we do that? What are some of the tips?
Yes, thank you for that question. And you see the third bullet point there in that slide, I think, is the most important thing about these cultural values that we saw. That even though we might have different preferences, that doesn't mean that we're not able to work effectively across cultures. And that is why we need cultural intelligence. So the next slide shows us the CQ model. And again, this is based on extensive academic research. Based on a 2 decades long research, it has been validated that we can measure one's ability to work effectively in culturally diverse situations. And for one to be culturally intelligent, one needs these 4 capabilities: drive, knowledge, strategy, and action. And these 4 capabilities emerge consistently among individuals who can be described as culturally intelligent. So this is the CQ model. You see there, CQ drive, that's your level of interest, persistence, and confidence during multicultural interactions. This is your curiosity. This is the motivational dimension of CQ. Then you have CQ knowledge, which is the cognitive dimension of CQ. CQ knowledge is about your understanding of how cultures are similar and different. So what we saw with the cultural values, that's a big part of acquiring CQ knowledge. However, knowledge alone is not enough for us to be effective. So we need CQ strategy. CQ strategy is your awareness and ability to plan for your multicultural interactions. So this is the metacognitive dimension of CQ. It's your thinking about thinking. So first you have the motivation, you have CQ drive, you have that curiosity, you have a desire to engage in these interactions with people who have different cultural backgrounds, working in multicultural teams, reaching a diverse customer base. So you need that motivation. You also need the knowledge. So you go and seek the knowledge about the cultural groups that you need to understand to do your job, to be more effective. But then you need to plan for it. So you need to plan for those interactions, those projects, that new customer market. That's what CQ strategy is about. And then CQ action, which is the behavioral dimension of CQ, is your ability to adapt to those multicultural contexts. So you put that drive, the knowledge and the strategy into practice, into action. This is CQ action, again, about your behavior. And this is the only capability, CQ capability, that people will inevitably see. So this is about your behavior.
Okay, now to be a bit more specific about the CQ model, this actually leads me to my third question here, which is, what are the outcomes of this model?
That is a very good question. So I mentioned that there are 2 decades of academic research and rigorous academic research backing the CQ model and the CQ assessment as a predictor. So this is what these studies show. These are only some of the outcomes that CQ predicts: adaptability, decision-making, negotiation effectiveness, trust and idea sharing, and leadership effectiveness, all when cultural diversity is present. Okay, so in multicultural contexts, these outcomes are proven to predict, for CQ to predict. And again, if you are interested in seeing these studies and learning more, we can point you to the right resources for it.
Okay. And now my fourth and last question, which is a bit more practice focused. If I am to have this desire to further develop my cultural intelligence, improve in that area, what are some of your tips, recommendations, or tools that you can share?
Well, this webinar is a great start, but if you want to continue on that CQ journey, I would advise you to take a CQ assessment to understand your current level of cultural intelligence and determine which CQ capabilities you can leverage depending on your goals and your opportunities and the challenges you may be facing in intercultural contexts, but also the ones that should be enhanced, that you can work to enhance. You can also take a cultural values assessment, which is then simply descriptive, just to identify what your cultural value preferences are. And going to the Cultural Intelligence Center website, you see there culturalq.com. You can have access to both assessments, as I mentioned, as well as white papers, research articles, as I mentioned, and much of the information that I just presented, of course, in a much more in-depth way. You will also have access to e-learnings. You may enroll on our workshops, and we have the only CQ certification in the world. But until you get there, what you can do on this day and this weekend, for those of you enjoying a weekend, try to be more curious. Try to contact people who don't necessarily think like you, who have a different cultural background like you. Try to learn from them and try to think about, again, any challenges you may be facing and any goals, any opportunities you may have in multicultural context, and see how these few tips that we left here today may help you to address those challenges.
Okay. So thank you very much, Viviane, for the tips and recommendations. Now, as you already know, I tried to limit my questions to you to about 4 questions so that we can open the floor to participants' questions. So I'm going to ask the participants if you have any questions, just to share them with us in the chat. And we already have a few questions there. So from Asiel, is there a formula that can be applied to bridging the differences? The formula that works for me in many cases is vulnerability.
Vulnerability is a beautiful thing, and it's so comforting to me, at least, that in this age, in this era, it is okay for leaders to show vulnerability, right? When I was coming up in my career, when I was younger, my generation was not that used to having leaders be available, show vulnerability, but it's a positive thing, a very positive thing that now they can. It's not only allowed, but welcome. And this vulnerability means we don't know everything, and the leaders don't know everything, and they don't need to. And that's important, because then they are open to learning, and to learning what's important to others, and learning different perspectives. So the formula, the CQ model is the formula. Why is it a formula? Because even if you don't know, we presented some of the cultural value differences. Even if you don't know about those differences or similarities, even if you don't have an opportunity, if you apply that model, the formula being be motivated, curious, vulnerable, and persistent in engaging in these multicultural interactions, seeking that knowledge. And then with the motivation and the knowledge, thinking about what you're going to do about it, planning for a new team member, a new initiative, a new project, a new customer market, plan for it, and then actually adapt as necessary and appropriate. That's the formula that you can take to any multicultural situation.
Okay, now another question by Asiel is, when you say with linear people, do you distinguish between when a supervisor or a colleague deals with linear people? In other words, how different would these recommendations be if the person is in the position of power?
Sure. And again, that can also have to do with the other cultural value that we presented, which is power distance, right? So what we're trying to advocate for here is for inclusive environments. If you operate in a more homogeneous environment where high power distance is the norm, then you might not have a lot of room for dissent. You might not have a lot of room to say, you know, I don't work like that. But as much as you can, try to do that. And of course, it's everyone's responsibility to accommodate these different preferences. So being linear can be a great thing depending on the project that you're engaging in, but it can be not so great when you work, say, in retail. Most people who work in retail must be able to focus on several things at the same time. So even if it's not your natural preference, flexing your behavior to the extent that you will be more effective will be the most important thing. I don't know if how much the position, if you're in a higher position, how much that changes. So if you want to ask, elaborate more on your question, I'll try to answer. This is my vulnerability.
Yeah. Now, a third question here is, what about multicultural teams? How do supervisors, for example, approach employees in a team who are so diverse? Do you use more low context or high?
That's a very good question. Usually, for multicultural teams, you need high context. Oh, actually, you need low context. You need to be a bit more explicit because different people will need different levels of information. So usually, and when I say more explicit communication, again, you don't have to be super direct with everything, but you probably need to be more clear about the decision-making process. Who is responsible for making decisions? What is the workflow? What are the timelines for each decision? And for that, in multicultural teams, the advantage or the advice would be to be a bit more explicit, so low context.
Yeah, and that's perhaps when you would be more specific about, for instance, how you schedule a meeting, the what, the how, the who is involved, what's expected in the meeting, the agenda, what needs to be prepared in advance, and so on.
That's an excellent example. And I would add, after the meeting, ask everyone to write down in a paragraph or email the leader, email the meeting organizer, or even 2-3 minutes at the end of the meeting. Make sure you get the understanding of each and every attendee about the conclusion of that meeting to ensure alignment. So that's when you have to use a low context approach.
Okay, the next question is by Dan. Are there books about CQ? I've read The Culture Map by Erin Meyer.
Erin Meyer is excellent. I really admire her, and at the Cultural Intelligence Center, we are fans of Erin Meyer. Well, I will recommend one that is sitting right here next to me. So, Leading with Cultural Intelligence by Dr. David Livermore. Dr. Livermore is one of the founders of the Cultural Intelligence Center, and he has about 8 or 9 books published. This one touches on a lot of aspects that we talked about today, about teams, innovation, productivity across cultural differences. So I would recommend this one, but any book by David Livermore for sure will help you with your cultural intelligence learning journey.
Okay. Then we have a question from Alicia. Hello, what an amazing session. May I have some insights about the CQ certification program?
Absolutely. Thank you, Alicia. The CQ certification program is what enables participants to interpret and apply the CQ assessment. So you say you take the CQ assessment and you can have someone who is certified help you. When you get certified, you are then equipped to use the assessment, apply it, interpret, and help coach others in their own CQ journey. The certification is offered virtually and in person. Virtually, we have about 1 session per month, and the session goes for 2 days, 2 4-hour days. When it's in person, it's a little bit longer because everything takes longer in person. So again, if you go to the culturalq.com website, you will find upcoming dates and locations for the CQ certification. We have a team of amazing master facilitators who are very experienced and have used the cultural intelligence model for many years, who facilitate these certification sessions. We also have train-the-trainer programs. So if you are interested in learning how to facilitate our cultural intelligence workshops in the same way that we deliver them, that is also available.
Okay. Jane, I'm sorry I have got the timing completely wrong and was so looking forward to joining the session. No worries. In fact, we're recording this webinar, so I'm going to share my email with you in the chat. Feel free to drop me an email and I can share the link to the recording with you. Any other questions? Okay, I have done a minor in cross-cultural business skills and I'm now doing a master in international business. Are there more studies about CQ?
There are so many studies, so many. So only on the CQ framework and the CQ assessment, there are more than 150 peer-reviewed articles. But every week, we have researchers who request permission to use the CQ scale, the CQ assessment in research around the world. So many studies. Again, on our website, you will find a few of them, and you can choose which ones apply to your own context. But if you don't find them there, you may drop me a note, and I can find you with some other studies.
Okay. So with that being said, we can now move on to the conclusion of this webinar. So on top of the fact that cultural intelligence is very relevant, is very important nowadays, I'd like to thank you very much, Viviani, for joining us today, for sharing your expertise, your thoughts, your experience with us. I'd also like to thank the participants for joining us, sharing their questions, their insights. Now, in terms of the next steps, once this webinar is over, we will shortly send you a post-webinar survey, which will redirect you into a page on our website. And that's basically when you can provide us with feedback, but you can also let us know if you're interested in receiving updates from us, but also from the Cultural Intelligence Center. Updates regarding certification events, webinars, and other types of events. On the same page, you can as well get your certificate of attendance. Now, if you'd like to get in touch with us, I recommend that you either go to the websites, so learning.eu or culturalq.com, or get in touch with us via LinkedIn. And we'll be more than happy to respond to your questions, to share input with you, feedback, material, resources, and so on. So thank you again, Viviani. Thank you, everyone. And I wish you a very pleasant rest of your day.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.